And this is where defendant reveals her plan of action, including having her Jewish grandsons baptized and offering $1 million to Dan Markel to facilitate this relocation. Control is a theme that's featured prominently throughout this email and throughout this case. There is evidence that the defendant controlled Wendy, she controlled Harvey, and she controlled Charlie, but she could not control Dan Markel. He wasn't going to give her a win. As long as you went along with her rigid, fixed ideas, things were fine. But if you didn't, things were not fine. Defendant continues to react to relocation being denied and Wendy's inclination to give up on the matter, including, everyone has a price. Now is the time to start. You said this divorce is not about winning and losing, and it's not a competition. You've already lost relocation according to the legal system. Well, it is about winning and losing. We're trying to get a win. You deserve it. You deserve so much more than a life without family, teaching in Tallahassee. Life is tough. If you don't stand up and take a chance, you don't stand a chance. Please, Wendy, do your part and stand up to him. Make an effort to do this so that our group offer will stand a better chance of being accepted. Don't let this temporary move to Tallahassee ruin your entire life. Fight for yourself, Wendy. We'll be there to help you. Just don't tell us that what you need to do is move forward with a sense of peace. Can't have that, can we? That's giving up. Giving up on relocation was not an option for Donna Adelson. Neither was losing. Throughout the trial, the defense tried to distance themselves from these emails. One of the ways they did that was by trying to put them off on Harvey. They pointed out, hey, this is a joint email account. One of these is signed Mom and Dad. And there's a few that are signed Mom and Dad, but it's clear that the defendant is the author of these emails and that she's the one driving the bus on this relocation effort. And during the presentation, we highlight all the dad and I language, all the indications in there that Donna is the author as opposed to Harvey being the author. According to her own daughter, Wendy, she's the dominant force in that household. And according to her son, Rob, she is a controlling person as opposed to the more passive, go with the flow type of personality that the dad, Harvey, has. In opening, the defense attorney told you that this defendant was a normal person, and you don't have to decide she's not a normal person. You're the judge of the facts, right? Was a crime committed? Is this the person that committed the crime? But in this email, she suggests that dressing her Jewish grandchildren up in Hitler youth uniforms would be acceptable. That would accomplish her goals. The ends justify the means for her, people. That is illustrated here, and it sums up this entire case. The defendant wanted this done because that was the only way left to get a win. If he had submitted, if he'd let her take those kids, he'd be alive. If he'd moved to South Florida himself, he'd be alive. But he would not submit. She could not get that win. He was a huge problem, and she made it Charlie's problem. To Charlie, who liked the idea of being a tough guy, who had connections to people on the wrong side of the tracks, the price of Dan Markel's life was worth the reward of pleasing his mother and easing her diarrhea and getting her to finally shut up about Wendy's divorce. In the mind of this defendant, all their lives depended on the success of this relocation effort. She tells you as much herself in these emails. Listen to her. And as such, any and all means were justified. Because not everything one has to do in life is comfortable or easy. Sometimes it's ridiculously hard. This is what passes for normal in this family. I said the defendant made Wendy's divorce Charlie's problem, and the evidence shows that the defendant did keep Charlie in the loop every step of the way. Here's a July 10th email that states, just to catch you up on what's happening with Wendy, and discusses who should be involved in the bribe that the family wants to offer to Dan Markel. On July 19th, the defendant requests, and Wendy sends her copies of the motions, responses, orders, and transcripts from her divorce so far. That same day, Dan Markel makes a settlement offer that this defendant encourages Wendy to reject, saying the answer is no to all of this. Please, Wendy, we've been with you from day one. Do not accept or sign anything without the two of us reviewing and discussing all of this with you. Screwing him financially is what will aggravate him. But ultimately, a settlement is reached. Y'all have heard about this date, July 31st, 2013. But contrary to what the defense has told you, the fighting did continue. On October 12th of 2013, 3 months after the divorce was final, the defendant forwards an email to Charlie Adelson, which Dan Markel had sent Wendy. And the defendant adds the note, "This is what this fucker is sending your sister on a regular basis. He is absolutely crazy. Impossible." Does it sound like everything was over? This was the amicable divorce over? Not contentious at all, right? This is fall of 2013, the same time frame in which Wendy starts dating Jeff Lacoste and Charlie starts dating Catherine Magbanawa. On October 13th, 2013, the defendant texts Charlie Adelson, quote, "Horrible evening for your sister." The pattern of this defendant getting worked up about Wendy's divorce and then forwarding it on to Charlie is seen over and over again. Which brings us to Halloween 2013. Several important events in the case occur on Halloween 2013. One, Wendy officially takes Dan Markel back to court, filing her motion to enforce the marital settlement agreement. So she's alleging he violated it, and she's asking to hold him in contempt of court, alleging that he's not paid the agreed upon fees that he was supposed to pay by a certain deadline. Wendy backs out of the contract that she had signed to buy a house in Tallahassee on Halloween 2013. Charlie later brags to the defendant that he talked Wendy out of buying the house, and the defendant calls him a miracle worker for having convinced Wendy not to buy the house in Tallahassee. Also, Charlie meets up with Catherine Magbanawa on Lincoln Road on Halloween 2013, the same day Wendy pulled the plug on the house, and broaches the subject with her for the first time of, "Hey, do you know anybody that I could hire to harm someone?" And she did. Charlie sends this picture of himself and Catherine Magbanawa together to Wendy that night, October 31st, 2013. First night, he solicited Catherine Magbanawa to be a part of a murder, or a part of what would become a murder. Mid-November, Jeff Lacoste meets the defendant for the first time. Remember Jeff? He was Wendy's boyfriend that testified. He said he would meet her 6 to 7 other times in addition to that first time during the course of his relationship with Wendy. Sometimes just in passing, picking Wendy up for a date. Other times more substantially, including taking the boys to the circus. And that becomes maybe important later. Meanwhile, the fighting continues into December. We're in December of 2013 by now. On December 16th, Dan Markel emails Wendy and the parenting coordinator that was assigned to help them try to navigate these issues about the defendant, Donna Adelson, disparaging him to his kids. In this email, he introduces what he calls a major issue. The headline on this concern is not buried, guys. Like he says, I'm introducing a major issue. He very plainly gives a preview of the grandma motion, which will ultimately be filed in March of the next year. And here he says that on November 8th, one of the boys announced at a Markel family dinner that grandma, referring to this defendant, says you're stupid. Grandma says you're stupid. Then the following Monday, on November 11th, when Dan Markel was buckling the boys in at the park, they both tell him that grandma says you're stupid. When asked why, they say because you're trying to take her sunshines away from her. When asked who are her sunshines, the boys answer they are her sunshines. Then again on November 30th, while playing with the older child, that child repeated the statements to Dan Markel, grandma says you're stupid. And again when asked why, the child repeated that the defendant said that Dan Markel was stupid because he was trying to take Grandma Sunshine's away from her. Markel implores Wendy to address the situation, as he would like to avoid a hearing in which his kids are going to be primary witnesses against their grandmother. He assures her that he will, though, if necessary, seek judicial relief that prevents contact between the children and their grandmother. This lawyer that testified said, oh, that wasn't going to work. Well, he didn't think so. Oh, well, that's no big deal. I've seen much worse than that in my career. Well, yeah. Dan Markel hadn't seen much worse than that. Dan Markel had a big problem with Grandma saying he was stupid, and he wanted to take it up and address it with the judge if necessary. Dan Markel emphasizes that this is a matter he takes very seriously and says that the defendant's actions could lead to the termination of Wendy's parental rights. Is that true or not? Doesn't matter. He thought it was true. He threatened it. And those are fighting words. Going to terminate your parental rights? Wendy forwards the email to the defendant the next day, December 17th. And what's the response? Wow. That's a response we see from the defendant quite a bit. She's usually more verbose. That's true. But why is the defense working so hard to say that their client didn't see this email and didn't know about these allegations? I mean, isn't it clear that Wendy is sharing all the issues relating to her divorce with her mother? Wendy communicated with her mother on all these filings, and this one pertained directly to her mother. Of course they discussed it. Are you really to conclude that nobody was fighting anymore prior to Dan Markel's murder when the evidence leads you to conclude the exact opposite? This was a pressure cooker, and it was being turned up hotter and hotter with each passing day. Not only is this a situation that's escalating between the actual parties to the litigation, but now the defendant has moved from working behind the scenes, helping Wendy with the divorce, to actually being the subject of the pleadings that are before the court. There was supposed to be a hearing on that issue. One thing Dan Markel wrote in this email is, quote, I fear that the children's best interests are not being pursued so much as what Grandma wants. If he only knew how legitimate that fear really was. Those weren't just some ugly, foul words thrown around in the heat of the moment, folks. They continued well past the finalization of the divorce. Here on January 10th, 2014, so now we're into the year where Dan Markel is killed. 6 months after the divorce is final, defendant says of Dan Markel, wow, is he on drugs? Is he also going to pay $70K plus the legal fees and interest that bastard owes you? So the bad blood is going strong here 6 months before the murder, and the divorce wasn't really final anyway, in the sense that we're continuing to have pleadings get filed back and forth. In February of 2014, Dan Markel emails Wendy threatening to file motions, exposing her for what he said was hiding assets, $200,000 worth of assets from the court, and giving false testimony under oath. And also to accuse her attorney of misconduct. Her lawyer witnesses say none of that's a big deal, none of that was going to be successful, but he thought it was going to be successful. To him, it's a lot of money. To him, it's a big deal. The next day, on February 15th, 2014, we see a text from the defendant to Charlie. Wendy's totally stressed out. Yesterday was a rough one. She will probably have to go through another depo. Outrageous. Rob Adelson testified that his mother told him they were, quote, depoing Wendy to death. But then their expert witness got up there and said Wendy was never deposed. I guess they didn't provide her with that information, or any of these emails or text messages post July 31st, because this thing was not over on July 31st. In this text, defendant accuses Dan Markel of stalking Wendy, and Charlie agrees. The defendant tells Charlie to keep the conversation with Wendy light and don't bring up the divorce drama, which kind of implies there was divorce drama going on. There's a sense in this email and elsewhere in the evidence that defendant and Charlie have to tiptoe around Wendy. like she's this damsel in distress that needs the two of them to step in and help her handle her business. On February 17th, 2024, defendant again reports to Charlie how Wendy's hearing went and talks about how there are plans to seek to have Dan Markel forced to submit to psychological testing. Here, defendant is 7 months after the divorce and just 5 months before the murder, responding to Dan Markel's filing a request to produce, and she says it's time to give it to him. Let's aggravate him the way he's trying to aggravate you. And what can your attorney do to be proactive to give him some grief? Can't you meet with her and work out a plan of attack? Something has to be done with this asshole. This is 5 months before the murder. Here, defendant texts Charlie about Wendy yet again. If you speak to Wendy today, tread lightly. Don't ask questions about the depot, her lawyer, etc. Tough time, and she's really stressed out. The asshole showed up at soccer yesterday, and she goes into a story about, he showed up at soccer and they got into it. And then she ends with such a fucker. Super amicable. Then we have this text on March 4th, switching gears. This is about the birthday gift. Defendant texts Charlie that she's going to call him from the bathroom in Gainesville where she can have some privacy. Please pick up because I will have very limited alone time today. Erase this text after you read it. Then the defendant says we'll speak privately about Dad's birthday gift. So erase after reading. You might think, well, maybe she was just trying to keep the birthday gift a surprise, but why does Charlie need to erase it? Harvey's not with Charlie, Harvey's with Donna. And according to Rob, there were no birthday gifts for Harvey unless the murder was supposed to be the birthday gift. Plus, in the text, Donna wants Charlie to delete after reading the text that doesn't mention the birthday. She doesn't say anything about deleting the one that does mention the birthday. Rob Adelson was present at the birthday party, which did take place between the two trips that the hitmen took to Tallahassee. And there were no birthday gifts, according to him. The defense suggests that the friends coming to the party was part of the surprise, but then they also suggest that Harvey sent the evite, so I don't think they can have it both ways. You can't send the invitations and be surprised by the friends.